So welcome everyone, all of our wonderful participants to webinar 3 of Teaching African American History webinar series with National History Day. Thank you very much for joining us. Let me make sure that I'm here. Okay. Tonight we have two wonderful experts with us. We have Dr. Gretchen Soren, who will be talking about migration and movement. And we have Miss Amy Page, who will be talking about the Exodusters and giving us some information about teaching for lower grade levels, teaching about Exodusters. This is the first time that we have had two folks from the same module, the curriculum expert and the content area expert presenting together as part of this webinar. So this is a really wonderful and exciting opportunity for all of us. I also have my wonderful colleague, Jamie Hollifield, with us. Jamie is personing the Q&A box. So if you have questions, any kind of technical questions at all as the night goes on, of course, put those in the Q&A box. If you have any questions for our Q&A session, which will take place at the end of tonight's program, Jamie and I will both be looking there for your questions to deliver them to Dr. Soren and to Ms. Page. A reminder that you are very familiar with now, which is that the survey at the end of tonight's program is required for your attendance. So do make sure that you complete that survey tonight, certainly if you are here with us live, or by the end of the week if you are watching the recording or simply don't have time tonight. Tomorrow morning, you'll see that the slides, the PDF of the PowerPoint slides from tonight's program, along with this recording, if you want to review anything, will be available in Google Classroom under the Module 3 materials. The next module will be available this Friday on March 3rd. And excitingly, Module 4 that drops on March 7th. Module 4 that drops on March 7th will contain information about the final assignment for this course. So I'm not trying to give you a teaser and just drop it there. The final assignment for this course will ask you to draw from new knowledge, new content, new active learning skills that you have encountered over the course of our time together in this webinar series to create a classroom activity or lesson, not a whole unit plan, but just a classroom activity or lesson to use within your own classroom. Okay. So with that, I am pleased to hand it over to Dr. Gretchen Soren, who is going to be talking to us about her research, things that she has produced within the history field that address the theme of migration and movement.
Thanks, Krista. The first thing I think I'd like to say is that mobility and travel are central to the African American experience. And if you think about what it was like in the United States during COVID, I think this is a really good way to start thinking about how central mobility is to just the American experience in general. During COVID, when you couldn't go anyplace, Americans got very upset, and we felt very, we felt this hampered our independence, and it hampered our freedom. And so if you think about how important travel and just the ability to go where you want to go, when you want to go, how important that is to a free society, to a democratic society. For African Americans, mobility is something that was really forced from the beginning. There, in the slide you see here, talks about the forced travel from Africa to the New World. May I have the next slide, please? And when African Americans did travel, they were required to carry a pass. So this is a paper pass that was given to, it says, please to let Benjamin McDaniel pass to Dr. Henkels in Newmarket, Shenandoah County, Virginia, and return on Monday to Montpelier for Mrs. James Madison. So this is a pass that the wife of the President of the United States gave so that one of their enslaved people could travel. if you were a Black person, an enslaved person, you had to have either a paper pass, or there were some tags, there were some metal tags that allowed you to travel or to go out and work for someone else. But African Americans had these passes that kept them under control. Many African Americans never left the property of their owners in their entire life. So they stayed on a single plantation for their entire lives. So you can imagine how important it would be for them to be able to just leave to go someplace. Next slide, please. And here you see a runaway ad for two mulatto boys. Travel was also brought about by running away. So we're not talking about travel that was pleasurable for enjoyment, but travel to get away, to end slavery, to get away from slavery. Two mulatto boys ran away from their owner. Next slide, please. And here again, this is a painting by Eastman Johnson. And I like to, in my research, since I am a curator, I like to use different kinds of sources. And paintings are a wonderful source of primary material, primary information. This one, you see a family running away, fugitive enslaved people on a horse. It's a little bit dreamy, perhaps. Generally, the people that ran away were not families. Mostly it was younger men, people that were unattached. But this is kind of a lovely painting that makes us think about what it must have been like in this time period, the mid 19th century, to think about escaping from slavery. Next slide, please. So the next step in the journey for African Americans, the travel journey for African Americans, was really the automobile and the Great Migration. The Great Migration begins early in the 20th century. There are multiple waves, so it really extends all the way into the 1970s. The Great Migration was the largest movement of people within the borders of the United States in the history of the United States. And for African Americans, they were fleeing the rural South and going to the North, to the West, and to the Midwest. This particular family, with all of their worldly possessions, they have an automobile. They're fortunate enough to have an automobile. They don't have to travel by bus or train, but they've strapped all of their worldly possessions on this car. And they're going to Cranberry, New Jersey. Next slide, please. Of course, public transportation was a lot less expensive, and it was also segregated. And here you can see a segregated bus with a colored waiting room. Segregated travel was very humiliating for African Americans. Sitting in the back of the bus, we all know the story of Rosa Parks, but there were actually many people before Rosa Parks who were thrown off of buses, who refused to move to the back of the bus and were removed from their seats. Bus drivers were often rude. You might get on the bus in the beginning of the bus, in the front of the bus, pay your money, and then be told by the bus driver that you had to go to the back of the bus and get on and sit in the back. And sometimes the buses would just pull away. So you'd pay your money and go to the back of the bus, and the bus would take off. So you would lose your money. You wouldn't be able to get it back. This was very common practice. Bus drivers were also often armed. And there were actually examples where the bus driver would shoot at people who refused to obey their rules. So taking a segregated bus, could be not only humiliating, but dangerous. And African Americans did not want their children to experience the humiliation of these segregated facilities, but they really didn't have a great deal of choice. Next slide, please. And here you can see a segregated train car. And on the back of the train car, if you look very carefully, you see those two wooden things that are sticking up in the back of the train car that say colored. So that was the colored section of the train car. Often, however, train cars were completely segregated. So you'd have a white car and you would have a black car. And the black car was very rarely cleaned. It was often right behind the engine, so that would be the engine would be belching out a lot of smoke and there'd be a lot of soot in the car. If there was a bathroom, it was rarely cleaned. So not only were the public facilities crowded, overcrowded, and humiliating, but they were often filthy. Next slide, please. African Americans love their cars. And obviously you can tell by the problems of segregated travel that they love their cars. They were much preferred to taking a bus or a train. If you had your own car, you had privacy, you had comfort, you had cleanliness, and sometimes you might have to sleep in your car because you couldn't stay in a local hotel or you couldn't eat in a local restaurant. So you could carry your food, you could carry everything that you needed in your car, and cars were big. This is an advertisement for the Buick Electra. And if you can read the top line, it says, "All the Electra lacks is a fireplace." So that tells you how big and comfortable they felt this car was and how pleasant. African Americans, the car that was the most popular was the Buick. And it was because it was large and you can see how soft and comfortable the seats were. And I call the Buick Electra, it's really your rolling living room. Next slide, please. And of course, there were lots of reasons for buying a car. Buicks were popular because they were comfortable, they were large, and they were hard to turn over. So African Americans chose cars specifically because of their safety, because they were fast and they could outrun someone who might be in pursuit, and also for status. Just as white Americans bought cars, you bought your car for status. And this is an example of a Cadillac on the street in Harlem. And cars said, "I've made it to the middle class. I can afford to buy a Cadillac. I've been successful." Next slide, please. The Negro Motorist Green Book, that I'm sure you know a lot about, started to be produced in 1936. And it was a tiny little guidebook that you could fit in your vest pocket or perhaps in your glove compartment. And it was a listing of safe places that you could go with your car. You could travel to nightclubs, to guest houses, hotels, tourist stops. There were resorts, but it also had things like barbershops and beauty parlors. And it was the brainchild, next slide, please, of Victor and Alma Green. Victor Green was a postman in New York. He had some friends who were Jewish, and those friends had a special guide that he saw. And that guidebook told American Jews where they could stay. If you were Jewish and you were traveling in the late 19th or early 20th century, you would have to be very careful, right? There was a great deal of anti-Semitism, and it was also very important that you be able to find a place that could deal with Jewish dietary laws. And so there were guidebooks. So Victor Green, in the very first edition of the Negro Motorist Green Book, talks about how he got the idea for the Green Book from his Jewish friends. He started this business to publish this Green Book, and he did it a lot by word of mouth and also by mailing out cards to people and saying, "Did you have a good experience at a particular hotel or motel? Did you have a good experience at a particular restaurant? Tell me about it, and I will put that establishment in my guide." And the Green Book starts just New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and then it expands to cover the entire East Coast, and then it starts to move west. It moves to the Mississippi, and then later on it covers the entire United States, as well as Mexico and Canada, and then ultimately, before it ends, it covers the world. I show you the picture of Alma Green, and I think she's very important because Victor Green dies in 1960, and although his name remains on the Green Book, Alma Green is the person operating the business. She is a businesswoman and a publisher, and a time period when women were not involved in publishing. And Alma Green does not get the credit she deserves for continuing to operate the business after Victor Green's death. Next slide, please. And these 4 women were her employees. So from 1960 on, the Negro Motorist Green Book was an entirely women-operated and women-owned business. And these 4 women were the writers and the business people that kept the business going until the late 1960s. Next slide, please. And now I would like to really talk about something that has been really important in my research, and that is how the automobile made the civil rights movement possible. And I would argue that you could not have had the civil rights movement at the time that it happened without the automobile. What you're looking at here is the cars gathered outside of the courthouse in Montgomery, Alabama, outside the jail, as police are bringing in the religious and the political leaders indicted in the bus boycott, which was from 1955 to 1956. The automobile made the bus boycott possible, and the automobile made the bus boycott successful. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we don't talk about is how Martin Luther King used the automobile as both a weapon and a tool. And this is an image. This is actually an image of Martin Luther King at the New York World's Fair, riding in one of the on one of the rides. But I think it's a great photograph because it does show him with 2 of his children in an automobile. And there aren't very many photographs of him actually in an automobile, although the automobile is essential to civil rights. If you think about how people got around, they certainly didn't want to ride in segregated buses or on segregated trains unless absolutely necessary. And the automobile allowed them to go to very rural areas, allowed them to go to places that trains and buses didn't go, and allowed them to go to places safely because they were in their own cars. Next slide, please. This is the Jenkins, it's called the Jenkins microbus. And this is an object that it's a 1966 Volkswagen, and it's at the Smithsonian. If you think about how the civil rights movement happened, what happened before it? You had people that were going out into rural areas, and they were taking voting opportunities for people to vote. They were registering voters. They were teaching people to read. They were doing all kinds of things with literacy. They were visiting people and bringing them transportation. They were bringing them vaccines. So they were doing healthcare as well. So they're bringing education and voter registration. So these were kind of rolling classrooms. And this is one of the ones that's extant, that's still with us. So a man owned it whose name was Esau Jenkins, and he and his wife Janie were going into rural areas, and they were traveling around, and they were registering voters. And they were hand lettered on the back of the bus were the words, "Love is progress, hate is expensive." And they were going around with their bus, and they were bringing people that could help them register voters, or that could teach people how to read who couldn't read, or to teach people how to pass the literacy tests that were required if you were going to try and vote. And so this particular bus, they decided not to restore it, but to keep it the way it is now. Next slide, please. And here you can see what the bus looked like at one point in its life. And this is the Jenkins family who operated this bus. And they hired other people to be drivers, and they hired family members and other people to go out with them and to take all of these services to the public. Next slide, please. So think about rural areas where people need to be registered to vote, who were not permitted to vote. And here you can see a voting, a line of people who were lined up to vote. You needed a car. You needed a car to get around. We know that the NAACP used their automobiles to go out into rural areas, to examine the sites of bombings, to examine the sites of churches and other buildings that were burned by the Klan. You just couldn't get around in a rural area without an automobile. Next slide, please. And the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott from 1955 to 1956 was a real triumph for Martin Luther King. It was one of his first triumphs, and it was an opportunity to tell the bus company that African Americans were not going to ride their buses unless the buses were desegregated. And here you can see people on bicycles, and you can see people walking. But what would happen if you lived in the Black neighborhood and you needed to go to the white neighborhood to work, which is what happened with many of the African American women who were either maids or cooks for white families? They needed to get to work. And that was one of the reasons they took the buses. Well, next slide, please. Martin Luther King and the organizers of the bus boycott got cars. They managed to commandeer automobiles and taxi cabs, black taxi cabs, and they would drive people to work. And here you can see Martin Luther King ushering some women into a car to take them to work. So one of the ways they were able to keep people employed was with a fleet of cars. Next slide, please. And here you can see the cars. So they actually purchased these old cars, and they used these cars to drive people to work. The records of the Montgomery bus boycott have only recently been discovered in an attic. They were discovered in the attic of the family of the owner of the bus company. And what they discovered was that the bus boycott was so incredibly successful, they actually completely bankrupted the bus company. And a year later, they actually go completely out of business. Next slide, please. So Montgomery's bus boycott comes to an end, and it is successful because of the automobile. Without the automobile, they couldn't have gotten people to work. People would either have lost their jobs, or they would have continued to ride the buses. So the automobile really works in that case. The automobile is also important in other boycotts. There's a boycott in Florida, and automobiles are important there. So in any of the boycotts to end segregation, the automobile is very important. Next slide, please. And this is the Rosa Parks bus, just to give you an idea of this important object in a museum. The Rosa Parks bus, or they call it the Rosa Parks bus, is now at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. And you can actually go onto the bus and sit in the seat where Rosa Parks sat. And I was actually, I was in Dearborn last year, and it was really amazing to see how important this was in the museum, how people really were excited to be able to go onto this bus. And it's been fully restored, as you can see, and it's very exciting experience. And I guess President Obama has gone to the museum and sat where Rosa Parks sat as well. Next slide, please. I mentioned that colored taxicabs were segregated, so that you had colored taxicabs and you had white taxicabs throughout the South. And the colored taxicabs were prohibited from going to the airports. So if you were going to fly into a city in the South, you could not get, if you were Black, you could not get from your plane to your hotel. And that was a real issue for civil rights workers. How do you get to your hotel? Next slide, please. Or how do you get from the to the site of the Civil Rights March? If you're going to a march or some sort of a demonstration, how do you get there? This obviously is Martin Luther King on an airplane. Next slide, please. Well, the answer is you rent a car. And this was the very beginning of car rentals. And African Americans would fly into, these are people who were working in civil rights, who were African American, going to a civil rights march or working in some capacity in civil rights in a city. They would fly into that city and then they would rent a car. And so the car enabled them to get to the Black Hotel, or to at least get from the airport to wherever they were going. Next slide, please. And this is a slide of Gaston's, A.G. Gaston's Motel. Gaston was a civil rights leader in Birmingham, and his motel was a site that African Americans were traveling to. And it was a motel. This is the age of the motel, when you could drive your car right up to the door of the place that you're staying and stay there overnight. And these are places that were actually bombed. Gaston's was bombed because he was a supporter of the civil rights movement, and because he was a part of assisting in civil rights marches. Next slide. Last slide, I think. And of course, this is the Lorraine Motel. This is the motel where Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And actually, you can see where how the cars could drive right up to the doorway. And the car was, these were motels that were designed for automobile travel. They're right on the highway. And Martin Luther King stayed several times at the Lorraine Motel. The Lorraine Motel was listed in the Green Book, in the Negro Motorist Green Book, as a place that was welcoming for African Americans. And it's today a museum, and you can go and visit the site. So that is, I believe that was my last slide. There we go.
Okay, sorry, that took me just a second. Dr. Soren, thank you so much for sharing all of that extra content with us. Participants had a good chance to read a lot of your work and to read about the Negro Motorist Green Book. And it's always exciting to learn just a little bit more from the historians who make those contributions for us. So thank you. We're now going to switch to the curriculum or pedagogy portion of our program for this evening, and to share with us her expertise about how and why to teach with this kind of content, and looking at a case study from 400 years. The lesson that she wrote and contributed is Miss Amy Page, who is with us tonight. So Amy, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about teaching with these materials.
Okay.
And then I will continue to move slides forward. So just tell me how I can do that.
Okay, and we've got a little bit of extra time to play with, which is probably good.
sure do.
Probably good because we have some, we had a lot of kind of interesting perspectives to look at with the lesson. And it was really fun to listen to Dr. Soren's kind of movement through the Green Book. And so again, I'm Amy Page. I teach in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I have really had fun kind of exploring this process. And so the expertise, so the question was when we first started this project, like what do I bring to the table with this? And so I have a background. I teach high school, but I have a pre-K through 12 background. So I've taught elementary and high school, and lots of different subject matter. So at the high school level, I work in U.S. history, U.S. government, economics, and AP U.S. history. So I've really had the ability to bring together a number of different curriculums. And I've also worked with lower and upper elementary. And I know that there's going to be a lot of questions that you guys have had. We've got a lot of different teaching levels. So I'm hoping that during Q&A, I can answer some of those questions for you guys, and to be able to really look at project-based learning, because project-based learning is really the focus of what I do. And when we started this process, I was really excited. I've spent a lot of time working with curriculum development at local schools, district levels, state level, curriculum review, and really also focusing on where there are gaps in curriculum. And teaching in New Mexico has also been sort of an interesting journey. So as we looked at this, I have so much respect for Dr. Soren's work. I remember there was this, when the research first came out, it really set off a movement for the Green Book. And teachers were really excited, and everybody said, wow, this is really cool stuff. We can look in data and we can look at the primary sources and start to develop lessons. And there were some beautiful lessons that came out of it. And Krista, if you can move that slide one forward, if you would, please, for me. And so I started looking into pieces in New Mexico. We have always taught in New Mexico, there has been this sort of basis of this tricultural history, but tricultural history really focuses on Indigenous populations, Hispanic, Latino, Latina populations, and that is the terminology of the local identifiers, and white populations. And that really leaves out every other perspective. And so when I started looking at the Green Book in New Mexico for my own kids when it first came out, I thought, man, we could get some really neat projects out of this. And so I started exploring local places in Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And I was really excited when I started doing that because I found personal connections to it and realized my students could too. So I pulled a couple of the pictures that I thought were really cool. So at the top, we've got the El Rey Court, which is in Santa Fe. And this was a hotel where folks could stay that was listed in the Green Book. And this place still is open today. I grew up in the hotel business in Santa Fe. My parents had a little tiny inn. And we would refer people to the El Rey. And then the De Anza, which is no longer in operation in its current form. My dad and stepmom lived in Albuquerque, and they had, you could have a little membership to swim in the pool. And so as a little kid, I swam at the De Anza Motel pool, and I thought that it was kind of a cool connection. And then we had Aunt Brenda's barbecue pit, and there's some pretty famous barbecue pits in Albuquerque that folks still eat at. And these folks are descendants of Aunt Brenda's family. And I thought, well, I need to bring this stuff to my kids. So we started working with the Green Book. And this was kind of right before COVID, and the kids started looking at this and doing lessons. But when we started this project, it was post-COVID, and the kids started asking really important key questions as we were looking with the Green Book. And the question was, how did these families get here? They didn't just appear because of the Green Book. How did these families that were community leaders, that were staples in the community, that were business leaders, that were members of important churches, that were influential, how did they get to New Mexico, and how do they get to other parts? Because when you looked at New Mexico history, and if you look at our history book, there's only one in the state. We've got Estevanico de Durantes, who comes in 1539, who is of African Moroccan descent. And then we have history of the Buffalo Soldiers. And then it kind of stops there with African American history. And so there's a gap in the curriculum. And it was really important to me to say, we need to look at this idea of hope for the West, and we need to go back a couple of decades and figure out, how do these families get to New Mexico? So if you go forward one more slide for me. And so we really needed to address curriculum needs. And it's not just in New Mexico, but it's throughout the West. And so we needed to go back far enough to figure out what was that pathway of hope that opens up this potential door to bring people into the West. And so there's a couple of pieces with homesteading acts back in 1862. And if you are an adult and you are 21 and you are a citizen or you are an intended citizen, did not bear arms against the U.S., you can have a claim. And so coupled with the Reconstruction amendments, it opens a door into the West. And so most U.S. history classes and AP U.S. history classes looks at the Homestead Act, but they don't necessarily look at the full perspective of the Homestead Act. And so we found, so I had my kids, we did this a little bit together. It was kind of a work in progress. And so I had my kids come up with these guiding questions. How do these businesses get there? And in this, we discovered Blackdom, New Mexico. I had some kids who had also done some research on Tulsa, and we discovered these all about Black communities that really had not been reported widely, that were not histories that many people had learned about. And so when we discovered Blackdom, New Mexico as a history that needed to be, we didn't discover it, but when we learned about Blackdom, New Mexico as a history that needed to be shared in our classroom, that's when it became apparent that this maybe was the focus of a project-based learning exploration that the kids could lead. And so it was also a really clear call in the curriculum. There's this entire gap of time that we don't have in the curriculum. And it's also a gap in the curriculum that exists in almost every state, because a lot of these communities existed for a period of time, and many of them still exist, but a lot of them also dispersed for a variety of different reasons. Some of them through violence, some of them because of the Dust Bowl, some of them because oil was discovered, lots of different reasons. And so when I work on this, I give my kids some prior-based knowledge. If you'll advance it one more slide for me there. Okay, so some of the stuff that we found in Homestead Act as we started exploring some of the primary sources also hit on these very same pieces of hope and freedom and movement. So if you look at the advertisements for Nicodemus, where you've got this large community and they're talking about this community where you're going to have safety, which is very much some of the same themes, where you can have a plot of land, you can grow on this plot of land enough food for your family, we can have businesses, you have the ability to be safer in this community than maybe the communities that you've left, safety in numbers. A lot of the homesteaders that come across as exodusters are going to come in groups. And some of them will come alone, but many of them will come in groups into these towns. And so getting the kids to be able to sort of explore that perspective was really important. At the time, when we created it, we based it all on very stable government websites and resources. As of this week, those are still standing and stable. If you go into the links that are in the lesson, you can still see the links that are there. But some of the really interesting things also that I have the kids look at when you look at the homesteading pieces, it's hard to really understand how many individuals, it's hard to understand the race demographics, because when you look at the homestead certificates, they don't record those demographics, right? You have the name of a person. This is Daniel Freeman's, and you can see sort of where the plot of land is on there. You've got a description of it. You can see the date. You can see the name of the issuing county, the issuing person, but it doesn't give us race demographics. And so a lot of the data is unclear. So we don't have a ton of data for that. Why don't you go ahead and advance it one more? All right. So the base of this is going to be project-based learning. It's always going to be inquiry-based. The guiding question on this one is, how did the settlement of all Black towns empower African Americans to shape their own independence and success despite the realities of hardships and racialized oppression. Hardships are going to come with just the reality also of how do you scratch and eke a living out of the land? How do you, oftentimes folks were leaving with just what they could carry on their back. They had whatever belongings they could bring with them. Some folks had wagons that they could fill with stuff. But a lot of the people who are homesteading, right, they're coming out there with their knowledge of agriculture that they have, with just sheer determination and sheer hard works and understanding of how to make things work. But it wasn't easy, right? You're coming into areas that are not necessarily easy to settle on. There are resources, but not a lot of resources in some of these areas. And it's a difficult experience for anyone coming. They are building towns, and sometimes they're at the mercy of what decision does the railroad make? Is the railroad going to come to this town or that town? And that's where racialized oppression is going to come in heavily with corporate decision. They are facing oppression from other settlers. We've got decisions about where territories are going to make decisions as far as, are we going to be entering into a union as free or slave? So they're going to get thrown into the Kansas debate. We're going to have all kinds of issues that they are facing throughout this decision. And then especially when we get into the 1910s and teens and we start to see Red Summer and some of that come up, we see a lot of these communities impacted by that as well. But the important thing is that the kids have a question in project-based learning, and every community that they explore has a slightly different story. It is unique in its own way. It's as unique as the individuals who settle in that community. It's as unique as the geography of that community. There's over 600 recognized. There's far more, but there's 600 that have been identified and recognized of these all Black towns. And so that's an important piece for project-based learning. The research is important because it's the sustained inquiry with exploration of the research. There's lots of great resources on the National Parks site that are still in that database, but there's so many other resources that they can engage in: museums, National Archives, Library of Congress, newspapers.com if you have those resources. Endless resources available. This particular lesson has been based around 6 provided sources, but you can also modify it to meet any community that works for you. And then the other piece is creating, and the kids are creating sources. And when I went through this process, my students were sort of they were the learning lab. We were coming back from COVID, and I had a lot of challenges with this particular group of kids. They'd been out of classrooms for almost 2 years. We were social distanced. They were wearing masks. And I had to figure out ways of getting my kids to speak to each other, figuring out ways to get them to engage with the material in a really meaningful way and think deeply about the material. How do you synthesize multiple perspectives, particularly with students who don't have a lot of, within our own communities, don't have a whole lot of knowledge about certain perspectives of a variety of racial groups. And we're coming from a community where most of our kids have 1 to 3% of the population is African-American or multiculturally African-American. So how do you get kids to understand that perspective, which is challenging because it's critically important that they do? So how do you get them to really dig into newspaper articles, journals, understanding the experiences of these individuals and really understanding what their successes were, what their challenges were, what they faced before, during, and as the settlements grew and over the span of time. And then having them create assignments that really had them express those perspectives through newspaper articles, through images, engaging in sort of letter writing and journal writing and that kind of piece. And so that was really important as well. And then sharing it with the classroom and the community was incredibly important. And making sure that they were presenting what they had done, presenting them. And there's a lot of different ways to do this, but I think that with project-based learning, that presentation piece is most important. There's a lot of difference between doing a project and then having students present their learning on a larger scale and having them present it, whether it's in a library, whether it's an open house. There's a lot of different ways to do that. And I can respond to that in Q&A. I can respond to any of these actually in Q&A as we move forward, but that's also part of that engagement and taking pride in what you've done. Go ahead and advance it real quick. Okay, so these are the 6 communities that are on the National Parks website. And again, if you Google them, some of the articles are still appearing. I believe these ones are still appearing. The main article, if you just Google homesteaders with national parks, I do believe one of the articles has been modified. But if you do the links, I believe that is still accurately showing. And I did a couple weeks ago and pull all of the articles. So I do have them in the form that they were written. And I've shared that with NA.
Yes, I will confirm that I have them posted. It's on everyone's Google Classroom. The primary sources are not all saved. So if folks are interested in looking through the primary source set, taking screenshots, now might be the time to do that. But the secondary sources are all saved as PDFs.
Good. And that's challenging because I know right now we're fine. I had a couple of sources I was working with in the classroom this week where it's like we clicked on a link and 404 page not found for other things. And so, yeah, we're all in kind of a new era. So, okay. So go ahead and advance it one more. Okay. So these are I've done this project a couple of times now with different groups of kids. This was the test group. These were the kids who actually helped me develop the project together. And they were the ones who said, this is how we think that it could be done. And this is how we would like to see it done. And so kind of different groupings the kids did. Some of them did flyers where they were advertising the community. Some of them wanted to do where they built a model of a home. Some of them did journal entries where they tried to tell the story of what it was like to go across, hundreds of miles and then try to, build a home and what it was like to come into an area where maybe they felt as if they were bringing some of their agricultural knowledge and trying to apply it into this new community and what it might have felt like. And so they really were trying to understand perspectives, which was really important. There's letters, but then they also have pieces where they have to provide analysis and reflect on the overall project, which is also really important, where they have to kind of synthesize all of the pieces together. And those are really important. And they're creating museum exhibits with, sort of citations and those kinds of pieces also, and building off of where did I find this research from? And you can also see some of the kids pulled the primary source pieces and they are captioning them. So for some of the kids, they did that. I had some students who pulled all of these pieces from some of the communities. And what they did is they pulled the primary source materials and created family albums to make them, to say, hey, this is the family album for this community. And then they told the stories of the communities in that way. And so they really did try to do them in very authentic ways. And very meaningful ways to try to understand the stories of these communities. What's the next slide? If you'll pull that up for me. Well, let's go ahead and advance here's another one. Some kids who really took some time creating their journals. And, you can also see during this time period, some of the kids had access to printers. The community that I worked in, we had a lot of not everybody has access to everything that they need. So some kids needed to handwrite, some kids were able to print. So we have a lot of different, we had to make a lot of accommodation for students during this time period. And you can see I didn't put a lot of emphasis on how fancy the board was, right? We had cardboard and we had a piece of fabric and it was okay. And they were proud of what they had created. And that was okay. You know, they got picture frames that they weren't using at the home and they put it together and they were proud of it. Go ahead and advance it one more. Okay. And the other piece is scaling for different grades. And I think this stuff, like how do you scale for different grades? How do you accommodate for time? How do you accommodate for maybe EL students or for IEP, that kind of thing? I can answer a lot of those questions. I think it's probably better to target those in Q&A. To give you a little bit of the background, I teach all my classes are full inclusion, whether they were AP dual credit or regular. And again, I've done the project very similar to this with different grade levels. I've also done it on a larger scale and a smaller scale. And the school that I am teaching at currently, we've got probably 25% of our students are EL. And again, I'm teaching full inclusion. And so I'm happy to answer any PBL questions folks have in any of those areas. I think that's kind of in a nutshell. I think I hit most of it. I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. I'm attempting to navigate multiple screens and couldn't figure out where the audio mute button was. So my apologies for that delay there. Amy, thank you so much for sharing that. You have an incredible wealth of information. And it's so valuable to be able to understand from your perspective the role and how this assignment filled particular needs within your own classroom, and to be able to hear from you, the person who created this, feels incredibly valuable. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. Let me just move over to a couple concluding remarks here before we move to the Q&A portion. So as I'm going through this should be familiar to everyone. Now would be a good time to start thinking about the questions that you want to pose to Amy or to Gretchen, or even to the both of them. I've had a lot of questions running through my mind that it seems like each of you could answer a certain aspect of. So if you have questions that don't get addressed here tonight, both of our speakers have been generous enough to share their contact information. Please contact them if you feel so inclined. I'll also take a minute and thank our sponsors, the 400 Years of African American History Commission and the Bezos Family Foundation make programs like this and make 400 years possible. So our sincere thanks to our funders and supporters and ongoing supporters of these very important programs, books, webinar series, other resources. So thank you to our sponsors. As we're getting towards the end of our hour together, a reminder that completing the survey is the way that you show your attendance in the webinar. So please follow the link, use the QR code to access the survey and complete it. But having this slide up here is our segue into the Q&A portion. And I see a couple questions already emerging. So Jamie, I'll hand that over to you.
All right. So the first question that is in the Q&A is this participant said that she spent years in the U.S. history room as an inclusion teacher. How do I get teachers to explore this piece of history? And I'm assuming of fellow teachers, encouraging them to explore these pieces of history.
Do you want me to jump on that one?
Please, Amy, go ahead.
So I think, there's a big movement for PLC and collaborative teaching. I think it's the big piece is where are the gaps in the curriculum, right? And so if we look at, I think obviously that, there's really clear, really good quality stuff leading all the way up through Reconstruction. There is definitely a gap when you get to the West. There's a lot of people even during, AP and US history, just like completely skip over that whole section. Like, oh, that's not the most important, period in history. And I think the problem with that is that we do leave a lot of these narratives out if we skip over it, right? And so, and I think that, and I think Dr. Soren could speak to this also further, is when you understand the importance of that freedom and that movement, and understanding that there's more to this story. There is more to like the social aspects of this story and how you tell it. And I think the trick is helping people understand how to let students explore that, right? It's when you empower the students to tell the story through project-based learning. People hear project-based learning and they freak out because they think it has to be a giant project. It does not. It can be a small thing that the kids present. I think that is the angle. I hope that addresses a piece of it, because it really does fill the gaps in the curriculum.
I have two thoughts. One is that when you're studying the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation actually talk specifically about mobility and the importance of mobility. The Constitution does not. And the reason they think that the Constitution does not was because it was already so essential. It was so key. It was so understood that mobility was important to freedom that they didn't put it in the Constitution. It was just assumed. My other thought is that one of the things that I found when I was doing this research is that people love the car. They love the automobile. And everybody, no matter what your background, can, they have this nostalgic view of the automobile. People, if you talk about going on family vacations, my father driving me to dance lessons, or, whatever it is, people have this very romantic American view of the automobile. We decided very early on that we were going to be a nation of drivers and not a nation of people who took public transportation. And although people do take public transportation in many of our cities, we are still a nation of automobiles. And one of the things that I found is that the reason this story, the story of the Green Book, has such resonance is because everybody remembers something about a car, whether it was their own family vacation or an uncle or an aunt coming to visit, or a Christmas holiday or a Hanukkah holiday, whatever it was, that they have a story about cars. And I've gotten what I call them my love letters. I've gotten a lot of letters from people that say, I remember when. And so I think stories like the automobile, stories about the car, stories about rites of passage. Somebody told me the New Jersey Historical Society did an exhibition on what it meant to be a teenager. And because everybody is a teenager or will be a teenager or was a teenager at some point, the stories that involve the things that we share have great resonance. And you can sometimes get people behind the history by picking those stories that have resonance for everybody. Rites of passage, like marriage. We get married in different ways, but it's a topic that has resonance for a lot of people. Or birth, or the automobile is one, food is another. So if you find those stories that cross ethnic, racial, cultural, religious lines, sometimes that's one way into some of the more difficult stories.
An anecdote that I can share. So Jamie and I both support student learning within the webinar series itself. And we're really active in the different posts that our participants are making. So with each of these different webinars, Gretchen and Amy, I'll share with you, there's a set of assigned reading that that we've drawn from your work, but there's some discussions and assignments that participants complete as well, where they select key terms, talk about definitions for those terms, provide context, and then seek to make links over all of the different readings that they have and resources that they've encountered over the across all of the different modules. There's another prompt that asks them to think about questions and observations that they have that haven't really gone answered, but that are still kind of marinating in their minds. And what really struck me about this current module are those personal connections that people had to the content itself, not just to driving, but encountering family histories by asking questions about personal contact that people's family, elders, ancestors have had with the content of Black and African Americans and the topic of migration and movement. So asking elders in the family, how did you actually go back to the South to visit after our family had moved to the Midwest? And I hope that those are ongoing conversations for a lot of our participants. But I just was really struck at the what seemed like an uptick in the sharing of personal anecdote and connection to the material at hand.
Okay, so the next question is, with accommodating ELL students, how can the sources be accurately translated in their language without losing the overall meaning or message? How can the sources be translated accurately and help with the inclusivity of diverse learning?
Amy, maybe that's another question for you to start with as the expert in
Yeah,
learning.
so we have to use a lot of Google Translate with my students. So I have a number of different students. Now, most of my EL students are primary Latin American Spanish speaking, but I do have other students who speak other language. And I know that depending on where you are in the country, you may have a variety of different students with different language. I also find that sometimes when we're translating sources, if it's, say, an image, right? How do you translate the words within the image? And so a lot of times we use these things, which are hotly debated right now in the classroom, but this tool is incredible because if in Google Translate, I can use the camera function and I can actually scan the text in the camera function with the proper language, and it will translate it directly there. And the translation is not bad. With most documents, we have to use, for most of my students, they use the Latin American Spanish translation and not just like Spanish. There's also a couple of different ones like Voila and a few of the others that we are using, but you do have to find the right translation. And so there are tools that you can do that with primary documents. There's a number of different, there are different groups online, and Jason Butler's got quite a few, and Chris and I are putting together some resources, and I'm going to try to put together some other resources for you to do that. There's also some translation functions within the Google Suite, if you have those, that are really helpful. So anything that I do, sometimes I am translating depending on the need of the student. Sometimes I have students doing some of the translation themselves. But the tools are there. You just have to be creative. If it's video online, there are settings for the closed captioning that you can go in, and you can adjust those settings. AI can do some, there's so many things right now that's like, oh no, we can't use the AI. We can't use the phones in the classroom. Sometimes you have to advocate. We had a no phone policy in our classroom, and I had to fight with admin to say, hey, in social studies, we've got to be able to use this technology. I hope that helps a little bit, but I will also respond to individual questions if you email me. And again, I'm going to try to put some more resources on that document that they've got for you guys.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amy. With the response to that, I want to point out that we're just over the hour. So for those of you who have other things that you have to attend to this evening, you are free to put that link in, to scan the QR code, and to make your way outside of the webinar. Thank you for joining us. You will find the recording tomorrow morning posted on Google Classroom, so you can pick up any of the remainder of the Q&A portion that we will continue with just a little while longer. I don't want to cut off responses to the question there. Dr. Soren, did you have anything that you wanted to add about English language or translation at all? Maybe
I think
particularly
Amy covered it very well.
Right. Okay.
All right. So our next question is asking, is there more information about Alma Green and the women that worked in the Green Book? I would love to share their story during Women's History Month.
So would I. I wish there was more information. That grainy photograph is the only one I've ever seen of her. And I talked, actually, during my research, I talked to her nephew, And there isn't more information that I have found about Alma. There is some information about her, very little in my book, Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights. But there really isn't a lot known about her, unfortunately.
That's too bad. I do really appreciate the impulse that that educator had to want to share more information about her,
I agree.
knowing that it's Women's History Month.
And I think people don't even mention her. They always mention Victor Green, but they never mention her.
Right.
And I think it's too bad because she really kept the business going.
Yeah. I really appreciate as well that you shared the names and the images of those other women who worked with her in the office. It's never just or rarely just a single person who is the muscle behind initiatives like the Green Book. It's often whole offices full of people.
And it's interesting that 3 of those women were Black and 1 was white.
Mhm.
And we know their names. We know a little bit about them, only what was available in the Green Book itself, because there were no business records. So we know what they wrote about, what they were interested in, but that's just based on the articles in the Green Book itself.
I
Okay.
see. Oh, Jamie, go ahead.
So there's another question. I think it relates to one of our other webinars that we talked about language. But this question is, how do you recommend sensitively handling the references to quote unquote Negro, since it is an uncomfortable term for many?
Oh. Interesting. Well, my approach is to talk to students about how language has changed. How in the 19th century, we used to use the word colored. The colored American, African Americans used that language themselves. There was a newspaper called the Colored American. And we have changed that language over time. And what I say is the language that we use now is African American or Black, capitalized, and or white, capitalized, even though, and this is the hard part, I guess, for kids, that is white is not a thing. And white doesn't, they're really meaningless terms. Race, there is only one race, and it's the human race. But these are terms that have been used for centuries to identify people as different from one another. And we use those terms because we need to be able to identify those groups, but the terms are not really meaningful terms biologically. They're about the phenotype instead of there's no such thing as Black or white.
Yeah. Right. And I think it's important that we recognize that they have to exist together in the ways in which we're using them historically and even socially. It requires a foil, it requires something against which to measure.
But I do like to mention the fact that if you lived in the 19th century and you were Irish, you would not have been considered white. If you lived in the 19th century and you were Roman Catholic, you would not have been considered white. If you lived in the 19th century and you were Italian, you might have been referred to as Black. So it's, these are monikers, tags, names that were given to people because of the way they look and because of the amount of melanin in their skin, but they don't have any biological meaning.
And as Jamie mentioned too, the first module and the first webinar addressed questions of language and how to use language appropriate in the classrooms and acknowledging the changeability of language and meaning over time. And that as educators, it's our responsibility to think very carefully about how we use language in the classroom. So to encourage folks to look at the resource by Dr. Renee Romano that is in 400 Years. Amy, is that what you were going for? Yes. Yeah. So there's some really good guidelines there about terms that are not acceptable or are understood as slurs in the present day, or just are not preferred by the community that they are referring to, that there are practices that we can have in our classroom and in our historical writing that still are able to point to those terms and the loaded meanings that they have without us having to use them in our own historical writing voices or educating voices.
The other thing I would add would be, and this is what makes it difficult, when you're doing research, even at the Library of Congress, you have to look up,
Yeah.
you have to use colored, Negro, African American, Black, because all of those, depending on when the document, the primary source, was cataloged, it may have been cataloged using one of those antiquated terms, and it may not appear, it might not pop up when you do a catalog search
Right.
on a computer.
Right.
So it's good to actually use all of those terms.
When we also talk about to our kids when they're doing their final projects, whether it's history day or a class project, when is it appropriate? Like if it's in a quote, and I find this oftentimes also when I have kids, I was correcting it with students just recently in my AP class. Oftentimes they will repeat the term in their analysis if it's in a primary source. And so getting them to understand in your modern analysis, it is most appropriate to use modernly accepted terminology unless you are quoting, but only quote if it is absolutely appropriate and necessary to prove your point, right? And so addressing that with student writing is also really important.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's a great point.
Bears repetition.
All right, so we have one last question, and it relates back to Alma Green. So the question is, Alma Green's picture presents as though she was mixed. Was she mixed or biracial? Would that have been an advantage to her being able to continue the business after the death of Victor Green?
Oh, interesting question. I don't know if she was biracial. I assume she was. Within the Black community, there are so many different skin tones and skin colors that in the Black community, it doesn't matter. I think Victor Green and the Negro Motorist Green Book had tremendous support, and they had the support that they had came from Esso gasoline, which was also Exxon, which is now Exxon. That's what we know Exxon, but it was called Esso in the time period. And they supported them because they were religious Baptists and they believed in integration. And the reason the Green Book was successful, I think, one of the reasons it was successful was that Esso gasoline saw African Americans as a market, as a future market. And therefore, they knew that as a future market, they could get money. So it was enlightened self-interest. They knew that if they allowed African Americans to use their bathrooms, the bathrooms at their gas stations, that African Americans would buy their gas. And that's exactly what happened. If you ask an older Black American what gas they bought, they'll say, we bought Esso. My parents always bought Esso because Esso allowed Black people to use their bathrooms. So they also distributed the Green Book. They bought it, they provided money for it, and they distributed it at their gas stations. And that was one of the things that made them incredibly successful compared to other travel guides. So it stands to reason that her skin color would be helpful. But I also think that the success of the Green Book has to do with their involvement with Esso gasoline.
And there was one more question from the forum. I almost forgot.
Ah, yes. Thank you, Jamie.
Okay. So this one says, for either presenter in general, how do former sundown towns reconcile their past? Is it swept under the rug? How does the community deal with it now, or do they deal with it at all?
I got a phone call last year from, I'm trying to remember if it was Oh, Manitowoc, Wisconsin. And the mayor, one of my former students, who is the director of the museum in Manitowoc, had called me, and he said that the mayor was incensed because he didn't believe that Manitowoc had been a sundown town, and could I tell them whether or not it had been? And I said, I don't know off the top of my head, but I will look it up. So I looked it up, and sure enough, Manitowoc was a sundown town. The mayor was the mayor was incensed, and he just couldn't believe it. Um, I don't think they do anything. I think there's a lot of denial. When you say swept under the rug, I think a lot of it is swept under the rug. Um, it's certainly every sign that I know of that was up has been destroyed. There are no extant sundown town signs that I have ever seen. Not a single one. So I think that's swept under the rug. I don't know, Amy, do you have any other information?
Yeah, no, I think this is when you think about, difficult histories like this, also when we sort of, put it into the larger context of everything, like how do you deal with your monuments history? How do you deal with any history that is difficult? I think most communities want to sweep it under the rug, right? It's like, that was the past. That was the past and we've moved on, even though, that intergenerational traumas and those realities still exist. I don't know. I think most communities don't want to go back to it. I think sweep it under the rug is how most of them deal with it. Yeah, that's what I would have to go with.
As I was reading through participant posts within the discussion for this module, one of the things that we try to do is connect them with other resources based on the questions that they have. So that requires a lot of further research on the part of Jamie and I and the other staff that are working to support participant learning in the webinar. And what that means is we become a lot more well-versed in the available resources. And one of the things that I found were a couple different, and I'll have to go back and share this with everyone, but a couple different oral history projects that are currently underway that aren't necessarily created by the municipalities themselves, but institutions of higher learning, colleges, universities, community groups that are seeking to centralize and create an archive of people's firsthand accounts and oral histories with travel using the Negro Motorist Green Book, with travel to and through sundown towns. So it seems like there are some efforts to at least capture and retain and organize knowledge about this period in history.
That sparks one of the, circling back to the question, how do we get teachers in our own communities to do this? First of all, my thought would be, what grabbed my kids was the connection for them to say, like, oh, I saw that hotel, I've seen that restaurant, I've seen, like, the Green Book was, so the more modern ones, like, yeah, it was every state, but also the oral history piece. There are people in all of our communities, but they're getting older, right? Like, what if you tap into oral histories within your own communities, the people who have these memories and have these working, stories that you, like, that would be an incredible, like, find your local historical societies.
Yeah.
Say, hey, here's a project we want to do. That is project-based learning at its finest.
Absolutely.
Here's a historical question. How did this, whether it's sundown towns, whether it's the Green Book, whether it's, some of those pieces, find a driving question, go to your historical society, go to, some of the other groups and communities within your whether it's a camp. I've worked in rural and urban settings. Find people that will work with you in your historical societies and create project-based learning. That is the community piece. And then find ways of getting it out there. That would be incredible for the kids.
Yes.
I don't think any you probably don't remember Foxfire. Does anybody remember Foxfire?
I have one in my house right now.
Foxfire was this absolutely wonderful program in the 1970s where kids went out and they gathered oral histories, they collected quilts, they collected folklore, they collected ghost stories, they collected, and it was sending them out into rural, I don't know if it was Kentucky or It was a rural,
Appalachia broadly? I don't remember exactly.
yeah, I don't know if it was yeah, it was somewhere in Appalachia where they were gathering those folk traditions that were still going on, divining for water, moonshining,
Building a
you know,
log cabin.
building a log cabin, making a quilt, getting maple syrup, hog butchering, and that was Amy's project-based learning, writ large. I mean, they were really out there, and I think there are 3 Foxfire books.
Yeah.
I think they ought to be brought back because they're wonderful models for History Day.
Yep. I just picked up a copy, the one that's in my house right now. I picked up a reprint of a copy at my local public library. The main branch of the Milwaukee Public Library has a resale bookshop, and I found one for $1. And
Oh,
it's
they're fantastic books.
the best dollar that I've spent in a long, long time.
Awesome.
All
All
right.
right. So we have one last final question. Somebody asked if Esso, meaning the gas station, or ExxonMobil, existed in sundown towns.
That is a great question. I don't know. I assume that there must have been Esso gas stations. There were Esso gas stations all over the United States. I assume there were some in sundown towns. I assume that whoever owned or franchised the gas station had a lot of control over, whether or not, it wasn't that Black people could not go to a sundown town or work in a sundown town. It was that you couldn't be in the town after sundown, and you probably couldn't buy property in the town or live in the town. But there were lots of Black people that worked in sundown towns. They worked as in service in rich people's houses, and then they had to be out of town by sundown. Hence the name Sundown Town. So I would assume that yes, there were Esso gas stations. Yes, they could probably buy gas there and get out of town.
I also wonder, having grown up off Route 66, there's so many gas stations that would also be just outside of town limits, right? On so many of those. So I wonder if there's also, that would be a really interesting correlation project. Woo, there's some project-based learning. Let's line that up.
Where were the gas stations? Yeah, that's right. They wouldn't be in the residential area.
Right. They might also be like where highways connect, and it would really depend on where you were, because when you think about traveling across the country and where these things pop up along highways, they're going to look really, really different in rural regions than they do in urban areas.
Yes.
Great point.
I think that concludes our questions. Okay. Dr. Soren, Ms. Page, thank you so much for your extended sharing of your expertise, your insight, your curiosity, and your knowledge. We are so very grateful for the contributions you made both to the book and to the webinar for tonight.
Well, thank you. This was very thought-provoking.
Yes, we have a lot of ideas to pursue, don't we?
It was great. No, it was great.
Yeah.
Well,
I have
thank
to
you.
go back to class tomorrow, and my kids are going to start plotting Esso gas stations.
I know, that's great. I love it.
Please report back. With that, I'm going to stop our recording.